For most Londoners who've been in the city for any length of time, you say the word or the words Cheyenne Apartments, and immediately a rather tawdry story comes to mind. At least that's the story that the public has. We may remember snippets of it, stories about rundown buildings, about problems with tenants, about tenants taking issue with the landlord, about the landlord being dragged through the courts, about building inspectors showing up, about community activists taking a role, some question about the accuracy or the impartiality of reporting from various news media in the city. It's a very mixed up and convoluted story. Eventually, the story died down when Elijah Elieff, who was the owner of those buildings, lost the buildings through power of sale to the National Bank. But that was not the end of the story. The buildings were bought by another businessman who has renovated them. Many of the tenants who were there, who were relatively new Canadians, have gone on, have prospered as the years have gone by and moved to other apartments, or in some cases bought their own homes. There are a few of the original tenants left, I'm told, but most of them are gone. The buildings don't look much like they used to. In fact, the name is even different. The street isn't there anymore. Cheyenne Ave isn't there anymore. But the story persists, and lately it's been back in the news with talk of the lawsuit against Reverend Susan Eagle, against the United Church of Canada, against the National Bank, and I'm probably leaving a few people out, brought by Elijah Elieff, who still believes that he was hard done by and wrongly done by as this story unfolded. Bob Metz has been an advocate for Mr. Elieff and a champion of his and a spokesman of his for a number of years now, and Mr. Metz joins us tonight on Jim Chapman Live. Nice to have you here,
Jim.
Bob.
Thanks for having me.
The story, I think, this operates on a couple of different levels, this story. Yeah. There is certainly a public story, which most of our viewers, again, people who've lived in London for a length of time, will have some familiarity with. And I want to address some of the issues that have been raised along the way, if I may. It's a very convoluted story. I'm not going to try to explain it all or to get you to explain it. We just don't have time. But I guess in a nutshell, we had a fellow who owned some buildings, who had tenants in the buildings. They were not these were not top-end buildings in the city. And as time went by, they fell into a state of disrepair for reasons which are still being disputed. Reverend Susan Eagle got involved and some other community activists seeking, they say, to protect the tenants' rights, to make sure the tenants were taken care of, and that led to a nose-to-nose battle with the landlord, Mr. Elieff. Some of the claims that were made at that time were that he didn't care about the tenants, that the buildings, he deliberately let the buildings run down, that he was not an adept businessman, and had he been, he would not have run into the kinds of problems that he ultimately did. I'd like to start back at square one. You know this man pretty well. I mean, is this a question of business skills?
Perhaps to some degree, but it certainly didn't warrant the kind of actions taken against him. Mr. Elieff was in a unique position in that he had relatively low-income housing, and the attention of his buildings was brought to the attention of community activists when he allowed a largely Asian population to move into those buildings, and that's when they became more, more of a target for community activists. So I guess that's the only way I could say it. And back in 1989, Mr. Elieff was trying to tell the public and tell the authorities that he needed help cleaning up his buildings, and he thought maybe because he believed that the tenants were not being instructed properly about how to keep the place clean. They were new immigrants to the country, fresh over from Vietnam and Cambodia, and areas where they were just not used to our style of living here. Susan Eagle got involved in 1989, and of course, and it became a public issue. Now, the key thing here was, and I found this out after I began getting involved with the case with Mr. Elieff before the Human Rights Commission, is that we discovered throughout the hearings that what was going on in the background is that Susan Eagle was lobbying for government money for co-op housing, and that she and the United Church of Canada, who employed her to do this work, basically wanted to take those buildings that Mr. Elieff owned and convert them into government-sponsored co-op housing.
But if there was a problem with them, if he was unable to maintain them and had problems perhaps relating to the tenants, would that necessarily have been such a bad thing?
Well, he didn't really have the problems until Susan Eagle got involved, and that's been part of the testimony of some of the witnesses that actually went to the current trial, including a lot of the witnesses who were tenants in the buildings during the period that this was all happening. This is where I got very, very, upset about the issue. I first went to witness what was going on at the Human Rights Commissions way back in 1992 and 3 and discovered that Elieff had a whole bunch of tenants coming in as witnesses who all said that he was a great landlord, that he leaned over backwards for them, let them in without first month's and last month's rent, that kind of thing, did them a lot of favors and did things for them that, you know, basically you're working at the low end of housing in the first place. And none of this, not a thing of it, was mentioned in the media coverage that the tenants felt this way about him. But behind the whole thing was this effort to get control of these buildings, and as Mr. Elieff alleges, so that Susan Eagle wanted these buildings for co-op public housing, so that the objective was to drive the value of the buildings down. Even when Mr. Surgatis took the buildings over after this was all over, Susan Eagle did not want him to renovate the buildings or bring them up to par, because she was still intent to get control of them, which of course never happened. And ironically, during the week that Mr. Surgatis got a hold of the buildings, I happened to run into Susan Eagle personally while we were downtown in the London Post Office, and she approached me and said to my face, you know, Mr. Elieff should sue the National Bank for improvident sale. But I guess little did she realize at the time that she'd be ending up as part of that lawsuit as well.
Now, Susan Eagle, I think we should make the point, is a very highly respected individual in our community who's done an awful lot of good work for people of unlimited incomes, people at the bottom end of the socioeconomic scale. She has, I think, a deserved reputation for being an advocate of theirs. You're suggesting and have suggested, and I should point out, too, that Reverend Eagle is certainly welcome to join us on the program at any time. And the reason we have Mr. Metz on tonight is that he has expressed concern publicly about the coverage in the free press, that Reverend Eagle's side of the story has been told rather too much and that Mr. Elieff's has not, and that's why Mr. Metz is with us tonight. But we are by no means here to present only one side of the story. Everybody is welcome on the program. Why did this go the way that it went? And I went back into some of the files and looked at some of the stories, and there were stories about sewers backing up and sewage in the basement of these buildings that wasn't attended to in an appropriate manner, shall we say, in a prompt manner.
Well, these things were attended to, but 5 minutes after they were attended to, the problem came up again. And I remember during the hearings, I got to look at all the evidence. I still have a lot of this evidence in my possession. And I would see like an invoice from Salmon Plumbing and Heating, where the plumber made a comment on the side of the invoice that said, no sewer is made to take these kinds of objects. And he listed all the objects that were being shoved down the sewer. Now, there's no reason that anybody would put that down there. And the implication consistently was that it was Mr. Elieff's fault that the sewers backed up. It was Mr. Elieff's fault that all these things were happening. Well, legally, that's true. It's his responsibility. But nobody in their wildest imagination can imagine a landlord going to his own property and vandalizing it and shoving things down into the sewers that shouldn't be there.
Well, nobody suggested that,
but that's the impression that comes across constantly. This man didn't care about his property. That just wasn't the case. There was an uncontrollable activity going on that property where people were actually vandalizing and making mess. Now, the problem was Mr. Elieff couldn't identify a single individual who broke a particular window, and therefore it always came down to, well, you know, can you prove it? Can you tell us who did it? Other tenants testified that they saw the children of some of the tenants, you know, breaking windows and doing things like that, but that doesn't make a case. And yet, so here's Mr. Elieff running to the authorities in the hope that they will help him rectify the problem. Instead, he finds out he is the victim of the law, and that the law goes after him, not after the tenants. It almost seems as though the tenants didn't have any responsibility either explained to them or just it wasn't in their consciousness.
We're going to pause for a moment. We will return with more of the story of the Cheyenne Apartments. Bob Metz is our guest, and we'll both be back right after this. We're talking tonight about the rather convoluted story of Elijah Elieff, the man who once owned the Cheyenne Apartments, who is currently suing a variety of people over what ultimately happened to his buildings there. Bob Metz is our guest, who's a close friend and has been a personal advocate for Mr. Elieff. Bob, I want to address another issue that's been brought up repeatedly, and that actually I want to say one thing first. That I did go through those buildings in the early 1990s. And it went through some empty apartments where people had moved out, according to Mr. Elieff, and I have no reason to doubt him, in the middle of the night or left with rent unpaid, and had trashed them, smashed the sinks, broken the toilets, filled the bath, not filled, but excrement in the bathtubs, holes kicked and punched in the walls, doors kicked open, and so on. So there's no question in my mind that there was real damage being done out there by someone. But I want to move along a little bit to one of the things that seemed to overshadow all the rest of it, and that was the claims that Mr. Elieff was a racist, and that most terrible of all words in our modern Canadian society was leveled at him. How much a part of the whole story is those allegations and his refutation? Because he said, no, I'm not a racist. I'm not prejudiced against these people.
Well, I looked at the evidence and I would conclude without a doubt that there was no racist comment. I mean, the original comment was made in a November 1989 London Free Press article written by Greg Van Moorsel. And in that article, Mr. Elieff was explaining to him who he felt was responsible for the mess and vandalism at his apartments, and he said it was his tenants. And he said this, and he also made the infamous little pigs argument, where he was talking about the children there. He says they're like little pigs living in the jungle. They're making a mess, you know. And this was how he expressed it in his broken English. But never once did he make a racial reference, nor did he imply that it was all one race making the mess. However, you know, the Free Press took one look at him. He was white. They took a look at the majority of tenants. They're Asian, and therefore that was a racist comment, even though the word Asian was not even mentioned by Mr. Elieff at any time.
How did it get to be such a big element of the story?
Because Susan Eagle pushed it, and she kept pushing it, and the London Free Press supported her, and it became the issue. Like, this is the big racism issue. Racism is a label that people use nowadays to quell a debate, to get you off onto another target. And it wasn't until I took on the case, and then we sent some researchers down to the London Free Press, or to the library, to look up old London Free Press articles, that we realized what the whole issue was about. It wasn't about race. It was about an attempt to take over his buildings and keep him distracted while you know, the attempt was going on. And personally, I think that same attitude is still being reflected in the paper today.
But there's been a change of ownership, there's been a change of publishers.
I expected a big change. I mean, I've got some of the latest articles here. There were about 5 or 6, and if I were a casual reader reading these, you know, these latest few articles on the Elieff case, I would be, you know, bound to conclude that here we have a racist landlord who, you know, let his property go. He doesn't like his tenants. He's
what are some of the headlines in that?
Well, former landlord seeks $1.3 million. Landlord admits lacking experience. Blames woes on Eagle, the usual things, you know, racial slurs. And, you know, here at the end, here's this really goofy guy named Bob Metz, who asked if Elieff had been a good landlord, says absolutely, no question. That was the only thing they quoted of me at the end of an article that talks about all these horrible things that Mr. Elieff allegedly did. Well, just to give you an idea of how that worked with Mr. Elieff, I'll tell you how this statement, though accurate, is out of context. The conversation that I had with Jonathan Scher when he called me was about the period before the time Eagle took over. We were talking about, you know, I mentioned that Elieff always paid his bills. I had all his PUC bills right up to the point that Eagle got involved, and they were always generally paid up to date. I told him about the testimonies of all the tenants, how they all liked him and thought he was a good landlord.
They all liked him? That's
well, pretty well, yeah, all of them. The ones that testified, there wasn't, no tenant got up to say anything against Mr. Elieff at any time except the tenant in question, who was Chip Ang Hom, and she was recruited by Susan Eagle and some city councilors at the time. But nevertheless, you know, at the conclusion of this conversation with Jonathan Scher, he says, well, so you probably think so you think Mr. Elieff's a good landlord? Well, in the context of that conversation, yeah, I said, yeah, he was, absolutely.
Is it not possible?
And then none of that's in the paper.
Is it not possible, Bob, though, that these stories reflect the reality? I mean, you've told us another story. You've told us a conflicting story. You talked to Paul Burton, the editor of the Free Press, on our radio program yesterday, and Mr. Burton seemed to feel that these were an accurate representation of the story as it unfolded in the courtroom.
They were partially accurate, but they were completely out of balance. I mean, how can you, one of the main things that Elijah Elieff was suing for was for an accounting of the rents that were taken from him. You know, in late 1992, Susan Eagle started collecting his rent without permission from any court or any authority whatsoever. She started collecting his rent money. January 1st, 93, he defaults on his mortgage. Later in 93, Susan Eagle got permission from a judge retroactively to collect those rents. Now, you got to picture the landlord's position during that period. What is he to do? He doesn't even have the right to his rents. He doesn't know what his ownership status is with the buildings. And that's the period where all the deterioration started happening. And subsequently, when the National Bank of Canada wouldn't take over the buildings, that's mostly the period that you're hearing about with the deterioration of the buildings.
So your contention is that the story that has been reported in the Free Press is not the whole story. You're not suggesting
absolutely not.
They haven't changed anything. You're just saying they haven't printed the whole story.
On the last Friday of testimony, Susan Eagle got up in front of the courtroom and she testified that she still had $4,000 of Mr. Elieff's money in an account on which she is the sole signatory, set up purportedly to be a trust account for the tenants, and yet they have no signing authority or any say on this money. And for 10 years, both Elijah Elieff and Mr. Surgatis have been requesting an accounting of this money because it was supposed to be considered in the final arbitration.
Surgatis is the current owner.
He's the current owner, and nothing was made known then. It wasn't until that day of testimony that Mr. Elieff even knew that she still had any of his money. And now, he suffered quite badly over this.
We've got only 2 or 3 minutes left, Bob, so I want to sort of wrap this up if we can as to where we go from here. Now, Mr. Elieff has sued Reverend Eagle and the United Church and the National Bank. Now, why sue the National Bank? They were just the mortgage holder.
Well, the National Bank was sued for improvident sale because they sold the buildings for about $420,000, which the new owner, Peter Surgatis, testified, saying that that was practically like getting the buildings free. He just bought it for land value. And the irony was that just 7 weeks earlier, he had a $600,000 offer on the buildings. There's no way those buildings...
He had made an offer for that much money to the National Bank.
Yeah, and it dropped to $420,000 in a period of 7 weeks. Now, there's no way that those buildings deteriorated by $250,000 in 7 weeks.
So where does the National Bank stand in this now? They've defended themselves against this charge.
They've defended themselves. Unfortunately, their key witness didn't really help their case very much because he was adamant that the lowest value of the building was $550,000.
And who was he? How did he figure it?
His name was Mr. Canning, and he testified. He was an appraiser of the property for the National Bank. And in the closing arguments, the National Bank tried to get him disqualified as a credible witness, but the judge made it clear that he considered him one of the most credible witnesses. So we don't know which way the decision's going to go as yet. But there certainly is more than one side to this story, and surely if people would like to see some more of the background on it, I'd welcome them to visit Freedom Party's website at freedomparty.org and just click on our Issues Index button and you'll see Cheyenne or Elieff, and just click on those and you'll see all the background story, and not just our side. You'll see the London Free Press articles as well as our interpretation.
Let me ask you this, Bob. If the court, and the case is completed now, we're waiting for a judge's ruling.
It's all over, yeah.
If the judge, I mean, is everybody involved? Well, I can't ask you about everybody involved. Is Mr. Elieff ready to accept the judge's ruling? If the judge says...
Well, he has to.
No, but I mean, is you know what I'm trying to ask you here. Is this going to settle it? If the judge says this, and this, is that going to be it?
It'll settle. I assume it's going to settle the legal end of things. I don't think there's much further that he can go with it unless some new issue presents itself. But where it goes from there is going to be more of a public matter in terms of taking this matter back to the public and letting them know what the whole other side of the story is.
It's been noted in some of the stories that Mr. Elieff is apparently in some dispute, or was in some dispute with his lawyer over paying the lawyer, that the lawyer wanted out of the case because he wasn't being paid. That seemed to some people to reflect back to some of the earlier charges that had been leveled about lack of business acumen and so on. Can you give us any insight into what that's all about?
Not really. It's a very complicated issue, but I know that Mr. Elieff has been paying his lawyer. His lawyer wanted a large retainer to go into the trial with, but he was ruled against. And
he asked to be relieved from the case, and the judge
said no way, because Mr. Elieff's gone too far. He's already spent over $20-some-odd thousand on legal fees. He doesn't have that much more to go, and I don't think it's going to be an issue. It's just a matter of following it through to the end.
Now, do you have any idea of a timeline on this? Does anyone know when the judge is likely to rule?
What I heard was within about a 2-week period, but whether that actually transpires in that given period, I don't know. I remember in front of the Human Rights Commission, we were told the decision was going to come down in 2 weeks, and it was almost 2 years.
Now, you followed this case very, very carefully and closely.
Oh, yeah.
Are you satisfied that all the facts were presented to the judge? Does he know everything?
No, he doesn't. He doesn't know a lot of things. That's just the way courts are. Only certain things are admissible. Only things you can, there are only a given number of things you can take into the court. You have to have a witness. In a courtroom, you can't deal with third-party hearsay, which is how the Human Rights Commission operates practically exclusively. And so it's a whole different ballgame, much more strict.
So we'll all have to wait.
We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Yeah.
Bob, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
Bob Metz has been our guest, and again, we extend an invitation to Reverend Eagle or anybody else involved in this case. They have equal access to our air anytime they would like to have it. You stay with us. We'll be back with our Media Misfire of the Day and wrap up tonight's edition of Jim Chapman Live after these messages.